Today we're going to talk about another one of the greatest writers in American history, Jack Kerouac. His most famous book is On the Road, and it's always in lists of the best American books ever written. Kerouac was born in 1922 in Massachusetts. When he was young, he liked to read a lot and also play sports. At the beginning, he focused on sport, such as American football and basketball. This was because he could get a scholarship to a good school if he was good enough at sport. However, his real dream was to become a writer. He wanted to write the great American novel, which is the book that would represent American literature. During the Great Depression in America, his family fell into financial problems. His father began drinking heavily and gambling. Kerouac went to New York after finishing school, but was amazed by the energy of the life there. He discovered a type of music that he would love for the rest of his life: jazz. Jazz would become one of the major topics he would talk about in his books. Around this time, he started trying to make money from writing. He worked first as a journalist and also wrote stories for magazines. While at university, he broke his leg during a match of American football and lost his place on the team. He left university early and tried to figure out what he was going to do with his life. After he tried and failed to get a job in the army, he went back to New York. It was at this time that he met a group of friends that would change his life forever. These friends were writers and poets, and together they started a literary movement called the Beat Generation. Kerouac's book, On the Road, would be the most famous work to come out of this Beat Generation. It's the story of Kerouac's adventures driving across America in the later years of the 1940s. He and his friend drove all over America during this time, met all sorts of people, and had all sorts of adventures. They sometimes drove themselves and sometimes hitchhiked. The book was mostly an autobiography and talked about a lot of the things Kerouac himself had done. It talked about jazz, sex, Buddhism, drugs, and travel. It was like a new Bible for the young generation of people in America, but also in the UK. It's one of my favourite books too. Kerouac's style of writing is very famous. He wrote in a constant stream of words, a flow of words. It was meant to be like jazz music, improvised and spontaneous. He wrote the book in one long session, lasting 3 weeks. He drank endless amounts of coffee, as well as a drug called benzodrine. At that time, there weren't computers, only typewriters. To write the book, he attached lots of pieces of paper together to make one very long piece. He could then continue writing on this long scroll of paper without having to stop to change the paper, like you need to normally on a typewriter. However, although he finished writing the book very quickly, it took him a long time to find a publisher. Many publishers didn't want to take the book because they saw it as too liberal. The book talked about things like drugs and gay sex, things that were not as accepted then as they are now. The Beat Generation was generally very liberal, and the generation that followed them was even more so, the hippies of the 1960s. Kerouac himself was actually quite conservative though, and he didn't agree with the hippies on a lot of things. While Kerouac was trying to get his book published, he worked on the railway and travelled around America again, this time making money. 6 years later, his book was published, and he became extremely famous. He wrote many other books over the rest of his life, but nothing would match the success of On the Road. He found it difficult to cope with how famous he'd become after the book was published. He slowly fell into alcohol and drug addiction, and later died from too much drinking. It was a sad end for someone who had been so full of energy and optimism in his earlier life. On the Road continues to be one of the best-loved books of all time. For example, Bob Dylan, the famous singer, said it was his favourite book. Kerouac's novels are full of music, travel, friendship, and the joy of life, and they take you back to a great time in American history.